The estate of Charles Whitmore stood hidden behind tall cedar trees and iron gates, just outside the quiet fringes of Seattle. It wasn't simply large. It was vast, almost intimidating, with wings that stretched in opposite directions and windows that seemed to watch the forest beyond. For years, few people had been allowed inside. Charles preferred it that way. The world, with its noise, its politics, its constant need for attention, was something he had long since abandoned. He had earned the title of reclusive billionaire not just through his money, but by his unwavering choice to disappear from the spotlight he was born into. Charles had inherited the Whitmore estate along with its empire, a collection of properties that dominated skylines and city blocks from coast to coast. His father, Richard Whitmore, had been a visionary in real estate, a man who saw opportunity in broken buildings and forgotten streets. Charles, although equally brilliant, lacked his father's warmth. He was methodical, private, and disinterested in small talk or sympathy. People called him cold. He never corrected them. Weeks before, Charles had undergone surgery on his lower back. Against his doctor's advice, he refused an extended hospital stay, choosing instead to recover at home where the silence could wrap around him like a blanket. He needed someone to maintain the estate during this time. Nothing complicated, just basic cleaning, cooking, and managing deliveries. The agency sent Angela Martinez, a 40-year-old single mother with solid references and a quiet demeanor. She asked if her teenage daughter could accompany her on occasion. Her reason was simple. She had no one else to watch the girl. At first, Charles barely noticed the daughter. Lily was 17, soft-spoken, always with book in hand, and unervingly quiet. She sat in corners, kept her head down, and spoke only when spoken to. Angela did her work efficiently, and Charles, mostly confined to the lower levels of the estate, spent his days reading or gazing out into the fog-covered pines. Then, on a Thursday morning, something shifted. He had been resting on the velvet sofa in the main parlor, a book splayed open on his chest, eyes closed. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, warming the carpet in stripes. He wasn't truly asleep, just drifting in that half-aware state he often used to keep track of his surroundings. Footsteps padded softly down the hallway. He recognized the rhythm. Angela wore firmer shoes that made sharp sounds against the floor. These were quieter, more hesitant. Lily, he heard the faint creak of the library door opening. That was odd. The library, his sanctuary, was supposed to be locked. He had told Angela clearly no one was allowed in there, but he had left it ajar the night before while pulling a volume from the back shelf, and in his fog of pain had forgotten to lock it. Eyes still closed, he listened. The door eased open fully. A pause. Silence. Then the sound of soft breathing, careful steps over the thick rug. He imagined Lily now, slim, wearing her oversized hoodie and jeans, her brown hair falling into her face as it always did. He imagined her eyes scanning the towering shelves filled with antique books, leather-bound collections, and rare manuscripts passed down to the Whitmore line. To most, it would have looked like clutter, but Charles knew the value of every piece in that room. Another pause. Then he heard the shuffle of a book being removed. Not ripped out, but gently, the rustle of pages opening. A whisper of a gasp, perhaps, or maybe just a sigh. More movement. The subtle zip of a backpack. Charles remained still. His mind raced, but he didn't move. He wanted to see where this went. A few minutes passed. Then the soft creak of the door closing. Footsteps retreating. Silence. When he opened his eyes, the sunlight had shifted. He sat up slowly, ignoring the sharp tug in his spine. The library door was closed. From his seat, he could see nothing out of place. He waited until the sound of Angela and Lily departing filled the entryway, and then when the house fell silent again, he stood. Inside the library, everything appeared untouched. At first, he scanned the spines methodically, searching for gaps or anything out of alignment. Then he found it, a missing volume from the third shelf of the east wall. The book wasn't just rare, it was irreplaceable. A first edition, bound in blue cloth, worn with time. His father's handwriting was scattered throughout its margins. Notes, reflections, half-thoughts scribbled in the man's tight, angular script. It was the kind of book no stranger could appreciate, but to Charles, it was sacred. Why would Lily take that? That night, Charles reviewed the estate's internal security footage. Nothing that streamed outside, only private loops for his own review. There she was, alone in the library, seated in the deep corner chair with a book on her lap. Her fingers traced the pages gently. She didn't read like a thief or a rebel. She read like someone desperate for connection, her eyes moving slowly, reverently. And then, just before placing the book back in its spot, yes, she had returned it, she slipped something between the pages, a folded paper. Charles paused the footage, zoomed in, and stared at the screen. His jaw clenched. There were no signs of damage or disrespect. In fact, she had handled the book with more care than most curators he had known. Still, questions flooded him. Why this book? Why sneak? And what had she left behind? He didn't sleep that night. Not from pain. From curiosity. From a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Intrigue. The next day brought the same gray sky and gentle drizzle that had lingered over the estate all week. Charles sat in his usual spot on the parlor sofa, a blanket loosely draped over his legs and a book resting open beside him. Though he had read none of it, his eyes kept drifting toward the hall that led to the library, listening. He hadn't confronted Angela or Lily. Not yet. He had read the note Lily left inside the book, but he had returned it to its place without touching the paper further. He needed to see more. Needed to understand what drove a 17-year-old girl to slip a personal message into a book written decades before her birth. Late morning, Angela arrived alone. Charles noted it silently and asked nothing. She moved through her usual tasks with calm efficiency, dusting windowsills, wiping counters, and setting a pot of tea on the stove for him. Around noon, she approached his chair with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "would it be all right if Lily joins me later today? Her school's doing an early dismissal." Charles kept his face unreadable. "That's fine." Angela looked relieved. "Thank you." She returned to her duties, unaware of the trap slowly tightening around the space her daughter occupied. It was just after 2 o'clock when Lily entered. Charles heard her before he saw her. Those soft steps that always seemed to avoid the creaky boards, a backpack half-zipped slung over one shoulder. She didn't come into the parlor. Instead, she drifted down the hallway, toward the back rooms. Charles adjusted his position on the couch, angled just enough to keep an eye on the corridor without appearing alert. Then it happened again. The library door creaked open. This time, Charles had deliberately left it unlocked. The inside of the room was untouched since the previous evening. He hadn't moved the book or the note. He hadn't even dusted the desk. He wanted to see what she would do, now that the mystery of the room had already been broken. Lily stepped inside, her silhouette catching the soft glow of light spilling to the high windows. She didn't go straight for the book. Instead, she paused in the center of the room and looked around, not with guilt, but with wonder. Then, with deliberate calm, she began moving along the shelves, tracing her finger over the spines as if reacquainting herself with old friends. Charles could not hear her, but he could imagine what she might be thinking. He had once stood in that room the same way at her age, overwhelmed, curious, isolated, as if the world outside meant little compared to the voices bound in leather and ink. Lily moved toward a different shelf this time. The west wall, where the classics stood, Homer, Faulkner, Morrison, Dickinson. She pulled down a thin volume of poetry, opened in the middle, read a line, then placed it back, then another, and another, never rushing, never stealing. At one point, she knelt to organize a stack of fallen books near the fireplace, stacking them by size and subject. Her hands were quick but gentle, as if the books might bruise under careless movement. She paused once, pulling a small notebook from her bag and scribbling something in it before tucking it away again. Then, almost exactly 20 minutes after she had entered, she stood, glanced around, and closed the door behind her. Charles exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. That evening, he skipped dinner and instead walked, cane in hand, to the library. He examined the spine she had touched, noting that several had been realigned perfectly. On a whim, he pulled down the volume of Dickinson she had lingered on longest. A corner of a paper peeked from between the pages. Not inserted, just marked. A tiny, almost invisible crease. He opened to the page. It was a poem about solitude. He read it, standing there in the dim light, and something tightened in his chest. He had read the poem countless times before, but this time it felt as if someone had underlined it with silence. The following day, Charles decided he would pretend to sleep again. Angela and Lily arrived mid-morning, and soon after, the sounds of soft cleaning began throughout the house. Charles arranged himself on the parlor sofa as he had the day before, a light blanket over his legs, a book open across his stomach, his breathing measured and even. Lily entered quietly, and this time, she didn't go to the library. Instead, she walked into the parlor. Charles kept his eyes closed. He felt her presence before he heard her steps. She didn't speak. For several minutes, there was only the sound of light movement, fabric brushing fabric, the occasional creak of floorboards. Then he felt it, the distinct rustle of pages being stacked, aligned. He risked the tiniest slit an eye. She was organizing his bookshelf, not the grand library collection, but the one beside the fireplace, the one filled with magazines, essays, and scattered documents he had meant to sort for years but never touched. Lily was standing with a small stack in her hand, arranging the volumes alphabetically. She was halfway through already, lips pressed in concentration. She didn't touch anything else, didn't look through drawers or wander. When she finished, she stood back, nodded once, then slipped a folded paper between two volumes and turned to leave. Charles waited until she was gone. The note, once unfolded, was brief. These deserve to be seen. Chaos hides meaning. He stared at it for a long time. That evening, when Angela came to say goodbye, Charles intercepted her at the door. "Your daughter," he said, his voice low and steady. "What has she read?" Angela blinked. "Everything," she said with a chuckle. "Anything she can get her hands on. She's been like that since she was a child. Always writing, always reading. Sometimes I have to force her to sleep." Charles nodded once. "Does she write too?" Angela looked slightly uncomfortable. "Yes, mostly journals. Some essays, but it's personal." He said nothing more and let her go. That night, Charles retrieved a locked box from the upper shelf of his closet. Inside was a single item, a leather-bound notebook belonging to his father, never published, never read by anyone but Charles. It contained musings not about business or real estate, but about human behavior, ethics, purpose. He had found it months after his father's death, but had been unable to finish reading it. It was too raw, too real, too different from the man he remembered. He placed it on his desk. Then he wrote a short note of his own and slid it inside the front cover. "If you're going to keep reading, read this. But only if you're ready to understand the man behind the empire." He left the library door unlocked, and he waited. The house stood still the following morning, the kind of stillness that felt like anticipation. Outside, mist clung to the treetops as if refusing to let the sun break through. Charles had risen earlier than usual, the ache in his back pulsing less than normal, as though something deeper within him was beginning to thaw. He spent the morning in his study, the old leather-bound journal from his father resting unopened on his desk. He had left it deliberately where it could not be missed, with the note inside and the cover slightly ajar. If Lily returned to the library, if she was as curious as he suspected, she would find it. Angela and Lily arrived shortly after 11 o'clock. Charles watched their car through the window as it climbed the gravel path. Angela exited first, then Lily followed, her backpack slung low, her hands tucked into her hoodie. She glanced at the house not with fear, but with the quiet awareness of someone returning to a place she didn't yet understand, but wanted to. Charles kept to the shadows of his study as they entered. Angela went directly to the kitchen. Lily, after a few moments of hesitation in the foyer, took the familiar route down the corridor. Charles moved to the corner of his office where a small monitor was set up, his private feed from a hidden camera inside the library, the same one that had recorded her first visit. He justified its existence as a security measure, but now it felt like something more. A window into a story that hadn't yet decided whether it was a memory or a beginning. She stepped into the library alone. At first, she didn't move toward the desk. Instead, She gravitated to the same shelves as before, her fingers dancing lightly across the spines, occasionally pulling a book out, flipping a few pages and returning it. Then she noticed the journal. Her body stilled. She approached slowly, like someone had found a living creature where they expected only dust and paper. She opened the cover. Charles watched as her eyes scanned the note he had written. Her expression didn't change, but her breathing shifted. She sat down in the chair nearest the desk and turned the page. She read for 20 minutes without pause. Not hurried, not overwhelmed, just immersed. Charles saw the faint furrow in her brow, the way she occasionally bit her lip when a sentence caught her off guard. When she reached the halfway point of the journal, she reached into her backpack, pulled out her own notebook, and began writing. She didn't copy anything. She wrote her own thoughts, her own responses, pausing between paragraphs to reflect. Then, after closing both books, she reached for a pen and a small sheet of paper from her bag and began writing a letter. Charles couldn't see what she was writing. He didn't need to. He recognized the posture of someone in conversation with a mind they respected. She folded the paper, placed it delicately inside the journal between 2 pages near the end, and closed the cover. Then she stood, turned off the desk lamp, and left the room without a glance back. Charles waited until she and Angela had left the estate before retrieving the journal. He walked with more effort than usual, but his pulse quickened with every step. Back in the study, he opened the journal to the place she had marked. The folded paper was there, perfectly creased, written in the same neat handwriting as before. He unfolded it slowly. "I don't know who you were when you wrote this, but I think I've been waiting to read these words my whole life. You saw people clearly. You asked the questions no one dares to. I've asked them too. I don't expect answers, but maybe we can ask together." Charles sat down heavily in his chair. There was no flattery in the note, no performance, only a depth that unnerved him. She was not simply borrowing thoughts. She was responding to them, echoing back with a mind entirely her own. He returned the letter to its place in the journal, then locked it in the drawer. Later that evening, after the sun had dipped beneath the trees and the last remnants of light faded from the window panes, Charles made his way slowly down the hall toward the back of the estate, a section of the house rarely used, reserved for guests who never came. He entered a room lined with boxes, old photo albums, and the belongings of a family that had once filled these halls. Among the dusty crates, he found one labeled with his father's initials. Inside were clippings, notebooks, and correspondence, some formal, others deeply personal. He pulled out a folder filled with his father's letters to colleagues, theorists, and even poets he had corresponded with anonymously. They weren't about business. They were philosophical debates, essays on responsibility, questions of legacy and impact. Charles read one aloud under his breath, and for a moment, it was as if his father's voice returned to the room. He understood now why Lily had gravitated toward that journal. It wasn't just intellectual curiosity. It was emotional recognition. The next morning, Charles sent a message to Angela through the agency, requesting that she bring Lily again if possible. He gave no reason. Angela accepted, though with a tone of caution in her voice when she confirmed. By early afternoon, Lily entered once more. This time, Charles didn't pretend to sleep. Instead, he waited in the library. When she opened the door and saw him seated behind the desk, her eyes widened, but she didn't retreat. She froze in the doorway, her hand still on the knob. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly. "I thought—" Charles raised a hand slightly. "You are not in trouble." She hesitated, then stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. Charles gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit." Lily obeyed, cautious but composed. He studied her quietly before speaking. "You read the journal." She nodded. "Yes." "You wrote something." "Twice." "I did." He waited, but she said nothing else. "Why?" he asked finally. She met his eyes. "Because someone in those pages saw the world the way I do. Not many people ask the kind of questions your father did. I don't know why, but I felt like I was supposed to find them." Charles leaned back, folded his hands in his lap. "You know who I am, but you didn't know who he was when you read those notes." "No," Lily said, "but it didn't matter. It wasn't about the name. It was about the thoughts. That answer sat with Charles for a moment longer than he expected. I wasn't always like this, he said quietly, almost to himself. I used to believe there was something worth building that wasn't made of steel or money. He did too. But life pushes other things in front of you. Lily didn't respond. She just listened. Do you write? He asked. I do. Not for anyone to read. Just for myself. You should consider sharing some of it. She tilted her head slightly. Why? Because connection matters more than you think. Lily considered that, then nodded once. After she left, Charles remained in the library long after sunset, staring at the shelf where the journal had been. Something inside him had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. Not yet, but undeniable. For the first time in years, he felt something more than resignation. Not hope, not joy. Something quieter. A stirring. The following days unfolded in an unusual quiet, even for the Whitmore estate. Rain had settled into a gentle but persistent rhythm, tapping against the high windows, wrapping the house in a kind of hush that made every movement feel deliberate. Charles spent most of his hours in the library, something he hadn't done in years, reading not just his father's words, but his own neglected notes, scattered across notebooks and yellowed pages. It was as though the past had cracked open, not with violence, but with invitation. Angela and Lily continued to arrive on their regular schedule. Charles now made it a point to be present when they came, exchanging polite greetings with Angela and offering Lily only a slight nod, which she returned without hesitation. There was an understanding between them now, unspoken but solid. He didn't ask where she went, and she didn't ask why he kept watching. He hadn't mentioned the journal again, nor had he brought up her letters or questioned her motives. And yet, everything had changed. The silence between them was no longer suspicion. It was trust under construction. One overcast afternoon, a different kind of visitor arrived. Charles was in the study, seated near the window, when the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drew his attention. The car that pulled into the driveway was sleek, black, and unmistakably expensive. Charles felt a shift in his chest as he recognized it. Raymond Black. Raymond had been his business partner for over 15 years. A sharp strategist with silver tongue and a watchful eye, he was everything Charles had once needed in a counterpart. But time had shown their philosophies diverge more with each passing year. Charles leaned toward vision, Raymond toward control. Without waiting for an invitation, Raymond walked through the front door. Angela had just finished vacuuming the main hallway and quickly disappeared into the kitchen. Lily, standing in the entryway with a notebook in her hand, stepped back toward the wall. Raymond's gaze swept over the interior, like someone inspecting a property before purchase. Then his eyes landed on Lily. His brow furrowed slightly. Charles met him halfway through the foyer, his cane tapping softly against the floor. "You could have called," Charles said dryly. Raymond smiled, his suit crisp, his coat still damp with mist. "And missed the charm of the surprise visit?" His eyes flicked again to Lily. "Is that the cleaner's daughter?" "She is," Charles replied, his tone unreadable. Raymond glanced at her again, then lowered his voice. "You're letting her roam the house now? She isn't a threat." Raymond gave a short, dry laugh. "That's generous. She shouldn't be here at all. This is your private estate, not a shelter." Charles's jaw tightened. "She's here with permission. That's all you need to know." "Charles, I'm saying this as someone who's been by your side through worse. You don't know what people like that might try. Vulnerability invites opportunists. A 17-year-old girl hanging around your personal spaces? That's risk, not charity." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. "I don't need advice about who I trust in my own home," Charles said evenly. Raymond gave a brief nod, though the sharpness in his eyes didn't fade. "As long as you remember who this place belongs to." Charles didn't reply. Instead, he turned back toward the study without another word, leaving Raymond standing in the middle of the foyer with damp shoes and a fading sense of command. Lily had watched the entire exchange in silence. She remained near the wall, her posture unchanged, but her eyes now flickered with something different. Not fear, not shame, awareness. Later that afternoon, when Raymond had left and the house had returned to its usual rhythm, Lily returned to the library. Charles remained in the study, but the door was open, and he could hear her movements. Soft, purposeful, familiar. He rose slowly and made his way down the hallway. She didn't notice him until he was already inside the library. "You heard," he said. She nodded without turning from the shelf. "He doesn't like that I'm here. He doesn't understand why you are." Lily closed a book she had been holding. "I'm not sure I do either." Charles moved to the chair opposite the desk and sat down with a slow exhale. "You're not here because you have to be. You're here because something brought you. Something honest. I've learned to recognize that." She turned to face him. "Does it bother you that I keep coming back?" "No." There was a long pause. "I used to think no one like you ever noticed people like me," she said. Charles didn't answer immediately. He watched her carefully, then nodded. "I used to think people like you didn't exist." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. He looked toward the journal on the desk. "You said you don't expect answers, but you keep asking." "Sometimes asking is enough," she replied. "It means I haven't given up yet." Charles looked down at his hands. "You remind me of someone I lost." "I figured," she said quietly. That evening, Charles returned to his private room and opened an old drawer beneath his bed. Inside was a box of letters written by his younger sister, Claire. She had died at 19, a sudden illness that took her in less than a month. She had been a thinker like Lily, always scribbling in margins, challenging the world, believing that words could shift its foundation. Charles had buried those letters along with his grief. Until now, he stayed up late reading them. The next day, he made a quiet decision. He told Angela to bring Lily again the following morning, with the excuse that there were books to sort. Angela, though suspicious of the growing requests, agreed. That morning, when Lily entered the library, she found something unexpected. The shelves had been deliberately disordered. Books pulled halfway out, volumes stacked on the floor, categories mixed without logic. It was chaos, carefully staged chaos. Charles sat in the armchair, a notepad in his lap. "I was wondering," he said without preamble, "if you'd be willing to organize them." Lily blinked. "Organize your library?" "Alphabetically. Topical where appropriate. I'll pay you for your time." She looked around at the mess. "Is this a test?" He met her gaze. "Does it matter?" She considered that for a moment, then walked toward the nearest pile and began sorting. Charles watched her for the next hour, not just a methodical movement of her hands, but the focus in her eyes, the way she paused at titles that meant something to her, how she occasionally whispered a line from a page as if to taste it out loud. It wasn't just work, it was care, and Charles, for all his wealth and power, had rarely seen care given freely. As the hours passed, the library began to look more like itself. But something else was changing too, less visible, more intimate. An invisible thread stretched between them, quiet and strong. Not family, not friendship, something simpler, older, recognition. The sky had cleared for the first time in over a week. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, making the wood floors gleam and the dust in the air shimmer like drifting particles of memory. Charles sat alone in the library, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him, his thoughts rooted not in the world outside, but in the folded paper he held between his fingers. It was the third note Lily had left, found tucked inside a poetry volume she'd handled during her last visit. Unlike the first two notes, which carried a quiet reverence for his father's words, this one felt more personal. She had not signed it, but Charles recognized the handwriting instantly, neat, careful, shaped by someone who thought before they felt. The note read, "I've stopped trying to belong in places I was never invited. But here, among these voices, I don't feel like I'm trespassing. I feel like I'm being remembered." He had read it 3 times before setting it down, and even now, his eyes kept drifting back to the phrase, being remembered. What did it mean to be remembered by a space? By a stranger? By a voice written before you were born? There was a softness to the note that unsettled him, not because it was naive, but because it was true, and truths, when left unguarded, had a way of cutting deeper than lies ever could. He didn't tell Angela he had read it. He didn't even mention to Lily that he had found it. But something shifted in him that morning. Something quiet but definitive. He began pulling volumes from the high shelves that hadn't been touched in years, placing them on a side table as if preparing them for a private exhibit. Books filled with thoughts his father never published, arguments and observations that once burned behind his cold, reserved face. When Lily arrived that afternoon, she paused in the entryway of the library, her eyes drifting to the new stack near the window. She glanced at Charles, who was seated near the fireplace, a pen in hand, notebook open. He looked up, nodded once, then returned his writing. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It had settled into something else, a pattern of mutual awareness that required no explanation. She stepped inside and approached the books. One by one, she began flipping through them, lingering over the margins where the handwriting was heaviest. Occasionally she sat and read quietly, jotting something into her own notebook, but mostly she moved slowly from volume to volume like someone moving through a gallery, not wanting to miss anything. Charles eventually looked up. "You found the note." She didn't ask which one. She only said, "Yes." He tapped his pen against the edge of his notebook. "Did you mean it?" Lily looked directly at him. Every word. "Why do you think this place remembers you?" She considered the question carefully. "Because I've spent most of my life in places that pretended I wasn't there. I know the difference." Charles closed his notebook gently. "You sound older than you are." "That's not always a good thing," she replied. "No," he agreed, "but it's rare." He stood slowly, stretching his back before walking over to the window. "My father built half of this estate with money he earned and half with questions he never answered. You've read more of his thoughts than most of the people who claim to know him, and you seem to understand what they meant." "I don't understand all of it," she said honestly, "but I understand why he was asking." Charles turned back toward her. "What are you asking?" Lily didn't respond right away. Then she said, "Why people leave, why they forget what matters, why some of us are invisible, even when we're standing right in front of them. That's not something a book can answer." "I know, but at least books don't lie about what they are." He let out a short, breathy laugh. "You think people lie more than books?" "I think books are honest about being unfinished. People pretend they're whole." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Charles sat back down, folding his hands in his lap. "Would you believe me if I said I used to think like that?" She tilted her head slightly. "Do you still?" "I'm not sure. I stopped asking those kind of questions a long time ago." "Then you showed up?" Lily didn't smile. She simply returned to the book in her hands, flipping through the pages with care. Later that afternoon, after Angela had finished her work and came to collect her daughter, Charles stood at the front door with them, something he rarely did. As Angela tied her scarf, he spoke without looking directly at Lily. "There's a reading room upstairs," he said. "Private. Not many people know it exists. It was my sister's. I haven't touched it in years." Angela looked up, surprised. "You had a sister?" "I did," Charles said. "Claire. She died when she was 19. Lily's expression didn't change, but she spoke gently. "What was she like?" He paused. "Like you?" Angela glanced between them, but said nothing. "I'd like to see the room," Lily said quietly. "I'll show you next time." Angela reached for her daughter's arm, clearly unsure of the sudden shift in dynamic, but Charles only nodded and closed the door behind them. That evening, he opened a different drawer in his study, one he hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Inside were Claire's notebooks, her drawings, her annotated novels. There was even a cassette tape she had once recorded, reading from her favorite book aloud in a voice that trembled and cracked. Charles listened to it for the first time in 20 years. The next day, when Lily arrived, he met her at the door. "Come with me," he said. They walked up the main staircase, past the west wing, to a door that had remained locked since his early 30s. He produced a key from his pocket, turned it slowly, and opened the room. Dust lingered in the corners. The curtains were drawn but faded from years of sun exposure. Books lined the walls, young adult novels, poetry, essays. A single armchair sat in the corner beneath a slanted window. A blanket, still folded, rested on its cushion. This was hers. Lily asked softly. Charles nodded. She used to sit here after school, refusing to come down for dinner until she finished whatever chapter she was on. Lily walked around the room carefully, her fingertips brushing the spines of books as if introducing herself to someone else's memories. Then she reached the armchair and sat down without a word. Charles leaned against the doorway. She would have liked you. She would have understood me, Lily replied. They stayed in that room for over an hour without speaking. Before Lily left that afternoon, Charles handed her something small, a folded piece of paper, much like the one she had left him. This was hers, he said. A note she left in one of my books when I was about your age. Lily unfolded it, reading the single sentence written in looping script. Even if no one ever hears you, keep speaking. The silence is always listening. She folded it again slowly and looked up at him. I'll keep it safe. I know you will, he said. That night, Charles walked the halls of the estate alone. He paused at the door of the library, then at the reading room, then finally at his father's old office. He didn't enter any of them. Instead, he stood in silence, as if waiting for something to answer him back. The following week unfolded with a fragile rhythm. Lily continued visiting the estate with her mother, slipping in and out of the library or the old reading room Charles had opened for her. Each visit brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Less formality, more quiet exchanges. Charles had begun to share fragments of his own notes with her, scribbled thoughts never intended for publication. She responded not with praise, but with genuine engagement, sometimes challenging his ideas, other times expanding them with her own. It wasn't mentorship. It was dialogue. But that fragile balance was never meant to last. Late one Thursday morning, the silence of the estate was broken by the abrupt arrival of a black SUV. Its engine cut out quickly, tires crunching against the gravel with finality. Charles, in the midst of reviewing an old manuscript in his study, stood and moved to the window. He recognized the vehicle instantly. Raymond Black again. No appointment, no warning. Charles walked down the hall with deliberate slowness. When he reached the foyer, Raymond was already stepping to the front door, his expression impatient, suit jacket unbuttoned, tie loose. "We need to talk," he said without pleasantries. Charles didn't reply. He merely motioned toward the sitting room. They entered, and Raymond closed the door behind them, lowering his voice immediately. "I just came from a meeting with the agency you use for staff placement. Apparently, the cleaner you've been employing, Angela, has been flagged for a contract violation." Charles's face remained still. "Go on." "She's been reported for bringing unauthorized individuals into a private residence. They're reviewing her entire employment file." "Which means what exactly?" "It means you're exposed," Raymond said sharply. "There's now a paper trail that connects a minor to a restricted property. If anything were to happen, any legal claim, any accusation, it wouldn't just be her name involved. It would be yours." Charles crossed the room and poured himself a glass of water. "She's been here with my consent. That doesn't matter to them, and you know it. I don't see why this matters now." Raymond took a step forward, frustration etched into his features. "Because I also got wind of something else. Someone's asking questions about your estate, about who's been coming and going. Journalists, quiet ones." Charles looked up sharply. Raymond pressed on. "You may think no one cares about your reclusive life, Charles, but people are always looking for stories. A billionaire with mysterious teenage girl showing up at his estate? That headline writes itself." "She's a child," Charles said coldly. "And the world doesn't care," Raymond snapped. "It takes 3 seconds for a misunderstanding to become a scandal." There was a long silence between them. The room felt colder than it had minutes before. "I can handle this," Charles said finally. "No, you need to end this. Now, pay the mother off if you have to. Close the door before someone else opens it for you." Charles turned away and stared out the window. "You've always seen the world as a series of threats, Ray, and you used to thank me for it. Maybe I've changed." Raymond gave a dry laugh. "People like us don't change. We just get tired of pretending we haven't." Without waiting for dismissal, he left. Charles stood there for a long time after the door closed. That afternoon, he didn't meet Angela or Lily at the door. Instead, he stayed in his study, listening as their footsteps moved through the halls. He could hear Lily entering the library, the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath her, the soft sound of her voice reading something aloud to herself. He almost called out to her. Almost, but he didn't. Later, after they had gone, he walked through the library in silence. On his desk was a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. I can tell something shifted. You don't have to explain. But please, if you're pushing me away to protect yourself, say it plainly. I've been through too many locked doors to not recognize when one's about to close. The handwriting was steady, unafraid. That night, Charles sat at his desk, the letter still beside him, and stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen. He opened a new document. Then he hesitated. Instead of typing, he pulled out an old folder marked with his father's initials. Inside were documents never released to the public, personal essays, theories, and drafts of letters never sent. Among them was one paper titled Trust and Power, a contradiction in terms. He read through the entire piece without pause. His father had written it in his final years, exploring the ways influence destroyed the possibility of genuine connection, how wealth had isolated him not by choice, but by fear of being misunderstood, misrepresented, misused. He had concluded the essay with a sentence that now struck Charles differently than ever before. If you cannot risk being known, then you will never truly be remembered. Charles closed the folder. The next morning, he called the agency and terminated the cleaning contract. No explanation. No room for negotiation. Angela arrived an hour later, not yet aware of what had happened. Charles met her at the door with a heavy expression. I ended the contract, he said simply. Angela's face froze. What? Why? He shook his head. Not because of anything you did. Or your daughter. I'm not letting anyone else decide what this looks like, but I had to sever the public connection. Angela's voice cracked slightly. Do you think this is going to stop people from talking? No, but it gives me room to act without them interfering. She looked up at him, eyes full of quiet disappointment. You think we were going to exploit you? No, he said firmly. I think you walked into a storm you didn't ask for, and I'm not going to let that storm touch your daughter. Angela pressed her lips together, nodded once, and stepped back. She's going to want to know why. I'll tell her. Myself. Later that evening, Charles called Lily directly. He had never done so before. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was calm, but tinged with caution. Are we still welcome? She asked. Yes, he said, but not like before. Things have changed. I figured. There are people watching now. People looking for a story. What are they going to find? He hesitated. I don't know, but I'm not going to let them twist this into something ugly. Silence. Then Lily said, You don't have to protect me from your world. Charles replied, Maybe, but it's the first time I've wanted to. She didn't speak again, but she didn't hang up either. They remained connected. Two voices stretched across a fragile thread of trust, neither sure how long it would hold, but both unwilling to let go first. 3 days passed without a single sound inside the estate beyond the usual settling of old beams and the distant hum of the furnace. For Charles, the silence was not peace. It was calculation. He spent those days preparing, not emotionally, but strategically. The threat Raymond had introduced wasn't just hypothetical. The calls to his staff, the warning from the agency, even the anonymous emails he received referencing unusual guests on the property. These were not random coincidences. They were signs. And Charles Whitmore, for all his reclusive tendencies, had never ignored signs. He didn't rescind his invitation to Lily, but he changed the terms of her next visit. Angela now worked privately under Charles's direct employment, no longer tied to the agency. The separation had been clean, but left a paper trail, one that Raymond would no doubt try to follow. It was only a matter of time before whispers turned to evidence, and Charles knew how quickly speculation could become ammunition in the hands of those who benefited from disruption. Still, he wasn't ready to let go of what had started. So, he did what he had always done when trust wavered. He tested it. On a Thursday morning, he instructed Angela to arrive later than usual. Lily came alone, dropped off discreetly at the rear entrance by a neighbor Angela trusted. Charles greeted her at the door. There were no warm pleasantries, only a quiet nod and a gesture toward the main hallway. She followed without question. The estate was still. The lights were dimmed, the furniture dusted, the air thick with something unspoken. Charles led her not to the library, but to his office. She had never been in this part of the house. The room was less grand than the rest of the estate, more functional. A large desk dominated the center, covered in folders, books, pens, and a thick envelope marked with a Whitmore family seal. A small fireplace burned low in the corner, casting long shadows across the wall. He didn't speak as he took a seat behind the desk. Instead, he pointed toward the open doorway. "I'm going to leave this room for 20 minutes, he said calmly. "You're free to stay, free to explore, free to walk away." She frowned slightly. "Why?" He didn't answer directly. "When I come back, I'll know something I didn't know before." Without waiting for a response, he stood and exited the room, closing the door softly behind him. In the hallway, Charles stepped into a side alcove where a monitor fed live footage on the office camera, not hidden, but mounted high and angled discreetly toward the desk. It was one of the few security measures he still kept running. He watched. Lily stood alone for several seconds, staring at the door. Then she slowly walked around the office, glancing at the bookshelves, running a hand lightly over the spines. She paused by the fireplace, warming her fingers, then turned back toward the desk. She noticed the envelope. For a moment, her hand hovered above it, not touching, just close enough that the heat from the fire might have still lingered in the wax seal. Then, instead of opening it, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small yellow sticky note. She wrote something quickly, peeled it off, and stuck it directly on top of the envelope. She walked to the far wall, examined a painting of the Seattle skyline, then returned to the chair across from the desk and sat quietly, hands in her lap. Charles didn't wait the full 20 minutes. After exactly 12, he re-entered the office. Lily stood as he approached. She said nothing. He walked around the desk and saw the sticky note. "You forgot to lock this. Be careful." There was no accusation, no suggestion of what she could have done, just an observation. A quiet reminder that she'd seen the open door, but had chosen not to walk through it. He looked up at her. "I had to be sure," he said. She didn't flinch. "Of what?" "That your curiosity had boundaries." "I know where the line is," she replied. He nodded. "You passed." "I wasn't trying to. That's why it matters." Charles folded the sticky note and slipped it into his desk drawer, next to one of Claire's old photographs. They didn't speak of the test again. But the next day, Charles did something he hadn't done in years. He invited Lily to join him for lunch in conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with climbing vines, orchids, and wild ferns that had been left to grow unchecked for over a decade. The table at its center had once hosted city leaders, developers, politicians. Now it sat covered in a thin layer of dust and memory. Angela joined them briefly to serve a light meal, then excused herself, sensing the moment did not require her presence. Over salad and fresh bread, Charles asked Lily questions about her writing, what themes she returned to, what voices she admired, what books had changed her. She answered honestly, without trying to impress him. She spoke of Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. She spoke of loneliness and justice, of the power of hidden stories and the danger of silence. "You're drawn to authors who confront the world," Charles observed. "I'm drawn to the ones who don't pretend it's simple," she said. The meal passed slowly, gently. There was no sudden revelation, no dramatic shift, just time shared between two people who had grown used to the sound of each other's silence. After lunch, Charles returned to his office and wrote a single sentence in his notebook. "She is not what the world expects, but exactly what it needs." That night, as he reviewed the footage one last time before deleting it, he noticed something he hadn't caught earlier. After she'd placed a sticky note, Lily had paused at the corner of the desk where a small, framed photograph stood, a faded black and white image of Claire. Lily had leaned closer, as if recognizing something in the girl's face. Then she had whispered a sentence, barely audible in the camera's mic. "I see you." Charles paused the footage, rewound it, played it again. Yes, those were the words. He stared at the screen long after it faded to black. The next morning, he found the courage to unlock the drawer where he'd kept the last of Claire's personal writings. He hadn't read them since the day she died. One of the pages was a letter, never addressed, but clearly intended for someone who would one day need to understand her. The final line read, "Whatever piece of me is left behind, I hope someone like me finds it and knows they're not alone." Charles closed the notebook and placed it beside Lily's most recent sticky note. Neither had been meant for him, but both had found him. The rain returned without warning, hammering against the glass panes of the conservatory and rolling down the stone walls of the estate in heavy sheets. Charles stood at the far end of the hallway that overlooked the garden, watching the grounds blur into a moving watercolor of green and gray. The atmosphere inside the house matched the tension that had begun to reemerge, quiet, pressing, like a conversation left unfinished. It had been only 3 days since the test, the envelope, the sticky note, the silence that followed. Charles hadn't spoken to Lily about it again, but something unspoken had cemented between them. He could feel it in her gaze, in her movement through the house, in the fact that she no longer asked permission to sit in the library or the conservatory. She belonged in the rhythm of the estate now, as if she'd always been part of it, which made the call all the more jarring. Angela arrived just before noon that Thursday, rain dripping from her coat and hair slightly unkempt. Her usual composed demeanor was fractured. She didn't speak at first, but Charles noticed a tightness in her grip on the umbrella and the way her eyes kept avoiding his. He set down his book. "What happened?" Angela took a breath and walked closer, voice low but steady. "They terminated me. The agency." Charles narrowed his eyes. "I thought that was already resolved." "No," she said. "They said after the internal review, they uncovered ethical violations. Their words, not mine. Apparently, I broke protocol by accepting private employment from a former client. They've blacklisted me. I won't be able to take contracts through any of their partners again." Charles stood. "That's not just retaliation. That's targeted." Angela nodded. "You were right. Someone's watching. I didn't think it was this serious until today." He paced the length of the room, then turned back to her. "Have you told Lily?" "No, and I don't plan to. Not yet." Charles considered that for a long moment, then said, "I can give you a full-time position here. Private, quiet. You'll never need them again." Angela didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window and watched the rain pound against the glass. "I appreciate that. I really do. But this," she gestured vaguely around her, "this isn't just a house anymore. It's something else. I don't know what my daughter's found here, but it scares me sometimes. Not because it's wrong, but because it feels like it matters too much." "You're afraid of what she's becoming?" "I'm afraid of how much she's already been through," Angela said quietly, "and how little it takes to destroy someone when they finally start to feel safe." Charles didn't speak. He knew she was right to be afraid. Angela turned back toward him. "You said people are watching. You weren't exaggerating." "No. Then if you're going to keep her here, even just as a visitor, you need to understand what that means." "I do," Charles said. "More than you think." Angela looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she simply nodded. "I'm not saying no to your offer. I just need time." Charles respected that. But the next morning, things took a turn. Lily arrived alone, soaked from the rain, hair matted to her forehead. Her eyes were sharp with confusion. Her mouth set in a line that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't peace either. She didn't go to the library. She went straight to Charles's study. He looked up from his desk and saw her standing in the doorway like someone who walked into a room they were never meant to see. "You knew," she said. He said nothing. "You knew what happened to my mom. The job. The agency." "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" "I was waiting for the right moment." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. There is no right moment for betrayal. It wasn't betrayal. "No? Then what do you call protecting someone from the truth because you think they can't handle it?" Charles's voice remained calm. I wasn't protecting you. I was trying to buy time. I was trying to shield you both from the fallout. Shield us, she repeated bitterly. Like we're fragile. No, he said, like you're targets. She stared at him for a long time, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had softened, not in tone, but in weight. You think you're helping, but you don't know what it's like to have everything decided for you. I do. She didn't believe him. Not yet. Charles stood slowly, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out an old manila envelope. He handed it to her without a word. Lily opened it and found several documents inside, newspaper clippings, scanned letters, old legal memos. All of them revolved around the Whitmore name, and more specifically, around the quiet scandal that followed his sister Claire's death, allegations of negligence, whispers of institutional failures, a history of people rewriting truth to protect legacy. She died before she could choose her life, Charles said quietly, and then they tried to erase her voice to preserve mine. Lily looked up. I was 17 when I watched them do it. He continued. I said nothing. I signed what I was told. I believe I had no choice. That's how it starts. Lily lowered the envelope. You've been carrying this for a long time. Not carrying. Hiding. Why give it to me? Because you deserve to know what kind of man you're angry at. There was a long silence. Then Lily said, my mom's scared. She has every right to be. She thinks this, whatever this is between us, could ruin me. Charles didn't deny it. But I don't want to walk away, Lily finished. He met her eyes. Neither do I. She held his gaze for several seconds. Then she walked to the fireplace, stood in front of it, and said, then maybe it's time to stop hiding. He took a slow breath. From what? From whatever this is meant to become. That night, Charles called his attorney and gave instructions for a new legal structure, one that would allow for discretionary funding outside of Whitmore Enterprises, under a private trust. He didn't explain the purpose, but the name on the document was clear, L.M. Whitmore Restoration Fund. He hadn't asked for permission, but he knew when the time came, she would understand what it meant. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Charles found himself opening doors that had remained closed not just physically, but emotionally, with each drawer unlocked, with every file pulled from forgotten cabinet. He uncovered fragment of a life he had long buried beneath years of structure, silence, and guarded legacy. The past was no longer something he could manage from a safe distance. It had begun to press into the present. Through Lily's words, through her questions, through the uncomfortable similarities he could no longer deny. It began with a call to a private investigator he had once used during a merger dispute 10 years prior. Discreet, efficient, and utterly silent. Charles didn't offer many details, only a name, Lily Martinez. Within 48 hours, he had everything. The file was thin but potent. Lily had been born in Tacoma, her early years marked by instability. Her mother, Angela, had struggled to maintain steady employment after her husband left when Lily was just a toddler. From ages 6 to 11, Lily had bounced between foster homes while Angela fought a brutal custody battle she would eventually win. The records were sealed, but Charles's investigator had ways of accessing what others could not. The reports were sobering, not of abuse, but of neglect at the hands of a system that moved too quickly and cared too little. What struck Charles most weren't the failures of the institutions, though they were many. It was a frequency with which Lily had been described in the records as observant, quiet, and intellectually ahead of peers. She had been flagged twice by school counselors as a gifted learner. Not once had any intervention followed. One notation, buried at the bottom of a school transfer form, caught his eye. Reads above grade level. Shows particular affinity for primary source materials. Requests history texts outside curriculum. Another note, older, from a temporary foster placement. Child found writing letters to authors. Seems to treat books as companions. Charles sat back in his chair, a weight pressing against his chest. Not grief, but recognition. This was not a coincidence. This was not some passing curiosity from a girl who happened to wander into his estate. She had been reaching out her whole life, and no one had listened. Not until now. He turned to the other part of the file. School records. Grades consistently high in literature, history, and philosophy. One teacher had commented, "She writes like she's searching for someone she's already lost." He closed the folder and locked in the drawer beside the photo of Claire. That same afternoon, he found himself climbing to the attic, a place he rarely ventured. The room was full of cobwebs and forgotten things, holiday decorations, old trunks, remnants of childhood that didn't belong to him. He found the box after nearly an hour, tucked beneath a rusted garment rack. The label read CW plus CW in faded ink. Claire Whitmore and Charles Whitmore. Inside were notebooks Claire had filled between the ages of 14 and 19. Some were half empty, others overflowing with annotations, doodles, and scattered reflections. He hadn't read them in years. One page, near the back of a dark blue notebook, was folded and marked with a dried-out rose petal. He opened it carefully. The writing was erratic, rushed, but the words struck him. "I see things in people before they see them in themselves. And then they run from it. Every time. But I won't stop seeing, even if no one believes me." Charles stared at the line for a long time. He carried the box down from the attic, placed it in the reading room Claire had once claimed, and left it on the table. He didn't leave a note. He didn't need to. Lily would know it was for her. The next day, she found it. She didn't ask permission. She opened the box and sat on the floor. The notebook spread around her like a fragile archive. Charles watched in the doorway for a while, saying nothing. Lily didn't look up. She flipped pages with reverence, sometimes pausing to reread a line, sometimes copying it into her own notebook. Eventually, she spoke. She was angry. Charles stepped into the room. She was relentless. "I think that's why I understand her," Lily said. "Not because I've lived her life, but because I've carried the same questions." She wanted people to pay attention, even if it made them uncomfortable. She wanted people to remember. Charles walked slowly around the room, touching the edges of furniture Claire had once chosen. She used to write letters and leave them in the margins of books, to people who would never read them. Lily smiled faintly. "I did that, too." "I know." There was a pause. Then Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder. "There's something I haven't shown you." She handed it to him. Inside were diagrams, annotated maps, lists of contacts, and a multi-page proposal. At the top was a title, Project Resonance. He looked at her. "I started it last year," she said. "It's not finished, and I don't have the means to do it, but it's what I would do if I could." He read the first page. The project's mission was simple but radical: to identify neglected public libraries in low-income areas, restore them with community involvement, and convert select rooms into interactive archives for local voices, unpublished letters, journals, and oral histories. Charles read each page slowly. Lily stood silent as he flipped through charts, budget estimates, even a plan for a mobile storytelling unit. "You wrote this alone?" "Yes." He looked at her again, the silence thick. "Where did the name come from?" "I wanted something that would echo." He closed the folder. "Do you want this to be real?" he asked. Lily didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then I'll fund it." She froze. "All of it," Charles continued. "Every line. But I have one condition." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What is it?" "You lead it." Lily blinked. "I'm 17. I'm aware. No one will listen. They will if the right person introduces you." "And you think that's you?" Charles gave a faint, dry smile. "No, I think that's her." He nodded toward Claire's notebooks. Lily looked down at them, the weight of the moment settling in slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She just nodded once and said, "Then let's begin." That evening, Charles drafted the first official document for the L.M. Whitmore Restoration Fund. The name was no longer just a placeholder. It was a bridge between the past and the present, between loss and legacy, between a man who had once believed in silence and a girl who had made him listen again. And somewhere, he hoped, Claire was listening too. The estate had become a space transformed, not physically, but in atmosphere. Where once there had been isolation, a quiet pulse of purpose now moved through its corridors. The rooms no longer echoed with emptiness, but held the soft weight of intention. Charles felt it most when Lily was there. She moved through the halls with quiet familiarity, always carrying a notebook, always pausing to write something down that she would not yet share. And he had stopped asking. Whatever she was recording, she would reveal in time, or she wouldn't. Either way, he had learned to trust her pace. But with trust came risk, and Charles had spent a lifetime calculating risk into every decision he made. He knew that loyalty required more than admiration. It demanded discomfort. And now that Lily stood at the cusp of something greater than the boundaries of his estate, he needed to be certain of her resolve. He needed to test the one thing she had yet to show, her capacity to face legacy not as a story written for her, but as a narrative she could challenge. He invited her to dinner. It was the first formal invitation he had extended since the day they met. The conservatory table was set with care, a white linen cloth, candles flickering in slender holders, plates that had not been used since his father's final birthday. Angela dropped Lily off, clearly sensing something different in the air, but said nothing. She trusted her daughter, or she had decided to. Lily arrived in her usual clothes, simple, unadorned, always comfortable. She glanced at the table and then at Charles. "You really did all this?" she asked. "I had help," he replied, "but the idea was mine." She took a seat slowly. He watched her, noting the quiet scan of her eyes, the way she mapped her surroundings. She didn't fidget. She never had. Dinner began with light conversation. Nothing personal, nothing invasive. They spoke of books, of a new exhibit opening in Seattle that featured first edition political manuscripts. Lily mentioned she had tried to get a ticket, but couldn't afford it. "I can have someone arrange that for you," Charles offered. She shook her head. "I'd rather earn it." He nodded. Of course she would. When the plates were cleared, he leaned back in his chair and watched her for a long moment. "I want to tell you a story," he said. She waited. "There was a manuscript," he began, "never released to the public, written by my father, hidden somewhere in this estate. It was supposedly unfinished, but there are rumors among collectors that it contains truths about the origins of the Whitmore fortune, things not in the official records." Lily listened without reaction. Charles continued. "Some say it was his confession. Others think it was a final lesson, written only for the next heir. But it disappeared before I could read it. And to this day, I don't know if it ever really existed." Lily folded her hands together. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to see what you do with that information. Do you want to find it?" "I want to know what it makes you feel." She was quiet for a while, processing. Then she said, "If it's real and it tells the truth, why would someone hide it?" Charles smiled faintly. "You always ask the right questions." "I don't care about the fortune," she added. "And I don't believe you do either. Not anymore." He tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because you wouldn't have told me if you still thought the story mattered more than the storyteller." Charles sat forward, elbows on the table. "What if it contained something dangerous? Something that could destroy everything built under your name?" "Then maybe it should," she said simply. That answer did not shock him. It confirmed something he'd begun to suspect. Lily wasn't drawn to legacy for the power it offered. She was drawn to it for the truths it tried to bury. "I have no manuscript," he admitted. That part was a lie. She didn't blink. "I figured," she said, "but I played along." "Why?" "Because I knew what you were doing." He raised an eyebrow. "You were testing whether I'd chased the myth or questioned the reason it existed in the first place." Charles leaned back again, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You pass." Lily shook her head. "That wasn't a test I needed to pass. It was one you needed to give." He gave a dry laugh. "You're better at this than I am. I've had more to lose." They sat in silence for a few moments as the last of the candle wax dripped into the holders. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the night air pushed gently against conservatory windows. Then Charles said something he hadn't expected to say. "I want to give you more than a project. More than funding." Lily narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I want to give you a stake. In the company. Not in the empire itself. But in a new division. A foundation that you will lead. Entirely. Your name. Your direction. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. Why? Because you're the first person I've met in years who doesn't want anything from me except honesty. Lily looked down at the tablecloth. I don't know how to do that. Lead something. You already are. It's different when it's real. It's never real until you make it so. She exhaled slowly. You're asking a lot. I'm offering a lot. Lily looked at him again. Then I need something from you, too. What is it? Transparency. No locked rooms. No quiet lies. If I do this, I need to know everything. Even the things you spent years avoiding. Charles hesitated, then nodded. I'll open the files. All of them. Lily stood from the table and walked to the edge of the conservatory, peering into the garden beyond. The night was still, the scent of wet earth and pine pressing against the windows. This isn't going to end quietly, she said. No, Charles agreed, but maybe we'll end right. She turned back toward him. Then let's not wait. And just like that, the final wall between them collapsed, not with ceremony, but with clarity. They didn't touch hands. They didn't speak again that night. But when Lily left the estate, she carried with her something she hadn't had before. Not permission, not approval, authority. She was no longer a visitor. She was a force. And Charles, for the first time in his life, was no longer leading alone. The Whitmore estate was quiet in the early hours, as it always had been, but now the silence felt different. It was no longer the product of solitude, but the aftermath of revelations that could no longer be ignored. In the days following their dinner, Charles had begun the slow, deliberate process of exposing his family's past, not just to Lily, but to himself. The archives that had once been buried under dust and fear were now spread out on tables and desks, scanned into drives, annotated, and organized by year, category, and consequence. Lily came every day now, no longer as a visitor, but as a partner. She moved through the house with quiet intent, cataloging documents, highlighting connections, and taking notes with precision that astonished even Charles. He had lived with these records for decades and had never truly read them until she began pulling threads he had never thought to follow. That morning, she entered the study with a small black notebook in her hands. It was thinner than the others, its leather cover worn but intact. She held it delicately as if afraid it might break. I found this in the back of the filing cabinet labeled CW Private, she said, her voice calm but firm. Charles looked up from a series of estate records. Let me see. She handed it over. The notebook belonged to his father. It wasn't a business ledger or a political journal. It was a series of personal letters, none of them sent. Each one addressed simply, to you. Charles flipped through the pages. One letter detailed a failed investment and how it had jeopardized their family's standing. Another spoke of Claire's death, written with an honesty that Charles had never heard spoken aloud. But it was the final entry that made him pause. You will find this long after I'm gone, if you bother to look. I never knew how to be a father, only how to build things. You deserve someone who listened more than he spoke. If you are reading this, then I hope you become a man she would have respected, and the man you were too afraid to be when I was alive. Charles set the notebook down, the weight of the words pressing into him like stone. Lily watched him carefully. You never showed anyone this? I didn't know it was there. She nodded, then sat down across from him. There's something else. She pulled a folded paper from her notebook and placed it on the table. It was written in her own handwriting, tight, deliberate, and composed. I've been writing letters to your father, she said. Charles didn't move. Since when? Since the first day I read his notes. I never planned to share them, but they helped me understand what I was feeling. It felt like speaking to someone who understood the world the way I do, even if he's gone. He opened the letter and read. I don't know if you would have liked me. I don't know if you would have trusted someone like me to walk through your estate and touch your books. But I read your thoughts, and I saw the parts of yourself you never showed the world. I think I would have understood you. And I hope somehow you would have understood me too. When he finished, Charles remained still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes no longer cold. I think he would have written back, he said quietly. Lily's voice was even softer. He did. Through you. They didn't speak for a while after that. The study was filled only with the soft scratching of pens against paper and the ticking of the old brass clock in the corner. Outside, the rain had stopped again, and the first hints of light pierced the clouds. Later that afternoon, they moved to the reading room. The table was now covered in open folders, scans of court transcripts and estate transaction histories. Lily pointed to a discrepancy in a file from 1993, a trust withdrawal that didn't match any known investment. "This amount," she said, "it's too precise, not rounded, and it doesn't match any external holdings." Charles leaned in. "What are you thinking?" "Someone took it for something personal. A payout, maybe hush money." He scanned the line. "It's possible." That was around the time Claire started pushing back publicly against the family board. Lily pulled out another document. "I found this in her college journal." She wrote that she was going to leak something, that she had documents proving one of the board members was involved in falsifying construction permits. She didn't name who. Charles went silent. "I remember that year," he said finally. "There was a scandal brewing in one of our southern developments. It disappeared overnight. I thought Father handled it quietly. Maybe he did, or maybe someone else made it disappear by removing her voice." "You think someone silenced her?" "I think she was alone when she tried to speak, and that someone made sure she stayed that way." He sat back, the weight of the implication folding over him. "If that's true, if she was threatened, manipulated, then all of this changes." "No," Lily said. "It just becomes more urgent." Charles stood and walked a window. The garden below was beginning to bloom, wild and overgrown in places where the landscaping had been abandoned for months. "I never fought for her," he said. "Not when it mattered, not when she needed someone beside her." "You're fighting now," Lily replied, "and you're not alone." That night, Charles did something he hadn't done since his 20s. He called a full board meeting. He didn't tell them what it was about. He only said, "The Whitmore legacy is about to be redefined. You want to be there." The meeting was set for 2 weeks from that day. Lily would be attending, not as a guest, not as a footnote, as the one holding the truth in her hands. When she left that evening, she paused at the door and turned to him. "You said once you weren't sure if you were the man your sister would have respected," she said. Charles nodded. She would have been proud of this. And then she was gone. He stood in the entryway for a long time after, the echo of her words staying long after the door had closed. For the first time, the truth wasn't a threat. It was a beginning. The final week before the board meeting unfolded with a sense of urgent stillness, each hour marked by invisible preparations, quiet coordination, and decisions that would ripple beyond the Whitmore estate. Charles no longer isolated himself in private corners of the house. He and Lily worked side by side now, poring over documents, assembling evidence, constructing a narrative that would not only defend Claire's memory, but expose what had been buried in the name of control. But the revolution they were building wasn't the kind that stormed rooms. It was slower, sharper, a quiet, methodical reordering of power. Lily arrived earlier each day. She no longer asked questions about where to go or what to do. Her confidence had grown, not arrogant, but rooted. She was beginning to understand the weight of her voice. And with that understanding came something rarer, restraint. She didn't rush to confront or accuse. She studied, she planned, and when the time came, she would speak not for attention, but for change. Charles had given her full access to his private archive. It was the first time anyone other than him had held the keys. Together, they had reconstructed a map of influence within the Whitmore organization, who had benefited from silence, who had leveraged legacy for personal gain. Lily's discovery about the missing trust withdrawal from 1993 had been just the beginning. There were more hidden settlements, confidential agreements, memos that had never reached public records, each one a thread in a fabric woven not by malice, but by quiet cowardice. On a gray Monday morning, Charles invited Lily to his father's office, a room he had entered only twice since Richard Whitmore's death. The space remained untouched. Leather chairs, a mahogany desk, and a wall of books untouched by dust. It was sterile, curated, lifeless, a museum for a man remembered more for his ambition than his intimacy. Charles motioned for her to sit. "There's something I need you to see," he said. He opened a small wall panel behind the desk and removed a thin black case. Inside was a drive labeled only with a single date, July 14th, 1993. This, he explained, was one of the only encrypted files my father ever locked with biometric clearance. I've never opened it until yesterday. He handed her a printed transcript, short, just 3 pages. Lily read in silence. It was a memo from Richard to the board, never sent. It described a meeting with a state regulator who had discovered illegal backdoor deals during construction of one of the company's largest developments. The memo didn't name names, but it made one thing clear. Claire had found out, and she had threatened to go public. The final paragraph read, "If we silence her, we destroy the best part of what this family ever was. But if we don't, everything we've built collapses. The truth is not what will ruin us. Our response to it will." Lily looked up. He knew. Charles nodded, and he chose the empire. There was no rage in her face, no tears, only resolve. She stood slowly. "Then I'm ready." That afternoon, they began assembling a formal presentation. Not a legal case, not a threat, a reckoning. Lily took the lead. She drafted outlines, timelines, created visual exhibits. Charles coordinated with his attorney, ensuring everything they planned to present could not be dismissed as rumor or slander. They weren't interested in revenge. They were interested in realignment. Word spread quickly. Some board members withdrew from the meeting. Others requested private calls. Charles refused them all. He made one thing clear in every response. This is not a negotiation. It's a restoration. 2 days before the meeting, Lily asked to speak with Angela. They met in the conservatory. Charles watched from a distance, giving them space. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he didn't need to. Angela's arms were folded at first, defensive. Then slowly, her posture softened. She shook her head once, said something sharp. Lily replied gently. Angela didn't argue. She listened. When they finished, they hugged and embraced tight with worry, but wrapped in something more enduring than approval. Later that evening, Angela approached Charles. "She's not a child anymore," she said. "You know that now." "I do." She's going to walk into a room full of people who see her as nothing but a complication, and she's going to speak like she belongs there. She already does. Angela's voice wavered slightly. "I used to think I had to protect her from people like you, and now..." Angela looked at him, not as an employer, but as a man. "Now, I think maybe people like you needed someone like her." The morning of the meeting arrived wrapped in a quiet fog. The boardroom was located in a sleek, modern tower in downtown Seattle. Glass walls, polished floors, and a long obsidian table that had witnessed decades of carefully orchestrated power plays. Lily stepped out of the elevator in a plain black dress, a leather notebook in her hand. She walked beside Charles, not behind him. They entered the room together. The board members, 12 of them, stirred slightly at her presence. Whispers, raised brows. One of them, a silver-haired man named Brennan, leaned toward Charles. "Who is this?" Charles replied simply, "The future." Lily stood at the head of the table. The room quieted. She began, "My name is Lily Martinez. I'm here not as a witness, not as an accessory, but as a voice long ignored. I've spent the last few weeks uncovering documents that were never meant to be read. I've read memos that never left a drawer. I've listened to the silence left behind by someone who should have been sitting at this table." She opened her notebook. "You don't have to agree with what I'm about to say, but you can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore." What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was precise, undeniable, and devastating. Lily walked them through the history of Claire Whitmore's suppression, how her warnings were ignored, how her findings were dismissed, how she was quietly written out of the company's history. She did not accuse. She revealed. When she finished, the room was silent. Charles stood. "I've spent my entire career upholding a legacy I thought was built on integrity. I now know it was built on silence. That ends today." He placed a folder on the table. This is a motion to create an independent division within the Whitmore organization dedicated to transparency, restoration, and community equity. It will be funded by the estate. It will be led by Lily Martinez. There were no objections, only nods, and then one voice from the end of the table. Brennan, what gives her the right to lead this? Charles turned to Lily. You tell him. Lily met Brennan's gaze. Because I've already started. And with that, the meeting was over. The revolution had arrived, not with a bang, but with truth. And truth, once spoken, doesn't retreat. Summer came slowly to Seattle that year, as if the season itself had decided to observe the changes unfolding before fully arriving. The rain lessened, the light lengthened, and with it came a shift not just in weather, but in rhythm. The Whitmore estate no longer stood as a monument to isolation. Its gates opened more often now, not to strangers, but to purpose. Rooms once silent echoed with voices that had never been welcomed before. The past had been unearthed, confronted, and, at last, repurposed. Lily stood at the front of a modest building on the south side of the city, a renovated branch of a library long considered beyond saving. Its red brick walls had been cracked, its windows boarded, its shelves stripped bare. But now, after months of planning, coordination, and deliberate effort, it stood fully restored, not in grandeur, but in spirit. Inside, the shelves were filled again, not just with books, but with voices, donated journals, letters, handwritten essays from people in the community who had never before been invited to see their stories as worth preserving. The doors would open in an hour. A small podium had been placed just outside the entrance, facing a row of folding chairs set up for community and invited guests. Among them sat Charles Whitmore, no longer hidden behind the formality of title. His suit was simple, his cane resting against the arm of the chair. He watched Lily from a distance, his expression one of quiet pride, tempered by humility. Angela sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes glassy with emotion. Lily stepped forward to the podium. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need them. She looked out the crowd. Residents, students, elders, city officials, former skeptics turned cautious supporters, and began. When I first read a note hidden in a forgotten book, I didn't know I was beginning a conversation. I thought I was simply responding to someone who would never answer. But it turns out, some conversations don't need permission to start. They just need honesty. She paused. This library was once written off, declared unsalvageable, a casualty of neglect and cost. Just like too many voices in our communities, dismissed, excluded, considered too complicated to invest in. Today, that ends. The crowd listened without interruption. Every restored wall hears proof that neglected space can breathe again. Every journal donated, every story archived, is a reminder that history is not something written by the powerful alone. It's something we reclaim, piece by piece, voice by voice. She stepped back on the podium, and for a moment, there was no applause, only silence. Then, slowly, the sound rose. Not explosive, not orchestrated, just real. After the ceremony, the building opened. Inside, the atmosphere was different from any traditional library. In one corner, a recording booth allowed residents to speak their own memories into an archive. In another, a wall displayed anonymous quotes submitted by visitors, sentences that might otherwise have lived and died in personal notebooks. Volunteers, many of them young, guided guests through shelves that combined classic literature with hand-bound collections of local writing. Charles moved slowly through the main hallway, occasionally pausing at displays. His hand lingered over a framed page from Claire's journal, selected by Lily and placed near the entrance with a plaque beneath it. She wasn't erased. The plaque read, she was just waiting to be heard. He stood there longer than he meant to. Later, Lily found him seated in a quiet corner, observing everything. You did it, he said. She sat beside him. We did. He nodded once, then handed her a small package, wrapped in plain brown paper. She raised an eyebrow, but opened it without hesitation. Inside was the first notebook she had written in while at the estate, the one she used to scribble down thoughts after reading his father's journals. It had long been missing. He had kept it quietly. I thought you might want it back, he said. She flipped through the pages slowly, as if recognizing her own voice from a different time. When she reached the final page, she found something new, a handwritten note in Charles's handwriting. "I once watched you pick up a book no one had touched in decades and treat it like it mattered. That's how I knew you would matter, too." She didn't say anything, but the way she closed the notebook, carefully, deliberately, was answer enough. That evening, as the last of the guests trickled out and the lights inside dimmed, Lily stood outside the library beneath a quiet sky. The building behind her now belonged to something larger than its history. It belonged to the people who had reclaimed it. Charles joined her. "You're going to do this again, aren't you?" he asked. She smiled. "Not just me. There are others already working on the next site. A school in Spokane. A reading room in Portland. Word spreading." "Good." He looked at her for a long moment. "I spent most of my life trying to preserve what my father built. Then I realized the only thing worth preserving was what he questioned. And now I understand it's not about preservation. It's about continuation." Lily turned to face him. "You're not afraid anymore." He shook his head. "Not of the truth. Not of what comes next." She nodded, then said something he hadn't expected. "You were right when you said you didn't fight for Claire." He met her eyes. "But she forgives you." He didn't ask how she knew. He just believed her. The next morning, headlines ran in quiet corners of regional news. Whitmore Legacy funds grassroots library initiative led by local youth. No scandal, no controversy, just a seed planted in public view. Charles returned to the estate later that day, walking its halls not with regret, but with acceptance. The house felt less heavy now, less like a vault, more like a home that had finally said what needed to be said. He passed the reading room and paused at the door. Inside, a single light was on. On the table sat one of Claire's notebooks, now joined by another, one of Lily's. Open side by side. 2 lives, 2 voices, no longer separate, no longer silenced. As he closed the door gently behind him, the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of what had been lost, and full of what had finally been found.